protesting the war in television. And in New York also. Not the South.
Self-hating Jews. What do you want?
Self-hating Jews.
What else is
Know what's going on in Harvard. Very bright. They don't know the history of. They don't know even the history
of the history. Anyway, all I'm saying is that that both of those elements are needed. We need to cry out to Hashem, as we're doing with recitation of Tehillim, but we also need to give chizuk to ourselves and to Am Yisrael there. And that means whether it's financial support, giving to some of the charities like Rabbi Yasker was correct in listing, like sending that out. Okay, if you haven't seen it, there's a list by the office among the announcements. Okay. Okay. We are. I'm sorry for getting on the soapbox, but we need to understand that both are important. Okay, learning sponsors: Year of Learning, Friends of Malaskotsky, Moshe Zelig ben Mordechai, Martin Lipman and family, in memory of his wife, Malka Chana Bas Pinchas, Friends of Herb Jeremiah, Tzvi ben Ze'ev, Friends of Sam Coleman, Shmuel ben Yaakov, Friends of Gideon Lazinski, Mordechai Shlomo ben Meir, Bella and David Adler, in memory of her father, Eliyahu ben Yosef Cohen. Those who were inspired by our Rebbetzin Emerita, Sheila Shapiro, Sarah Esther Malkabot ben Shulam Yisachar, Gail and Leslie Kaplan, in memory of their parents, Mushka Sprinzabat Yosef Chaim V'Chava, Chanan ben Moshe Eliezer V'Chana, Pesha bat Shmuel Yitzchak Halevi V'Tzipora, Isra ben Yoel Moshe HaKohen V'Chana, Rexford Friends of Gladys Sherman, Gutta ben Meir, Michael Klein and Friends of Judah Klein, Yudah Tzvi ben Chaim, Marsha Brana, in memory of her husband, Rav Yerachmiel ben Shmuel. A month of learning by Reuven and Susan Podolsky, in memory of his father, Tzvi ben Pinchas. All right. A week of learning by Ari and Judy Cohen, in memory of his mother, Fega bat Yechiel, and her mother, Hinda bat Moshe Zechariah Halevi. Michael and Sharon Glass, in memory of his father, Yitzchak Tzvi ben Yechiel Michal. Today, the day of learning today is the 17th. We have a day of learning by B. Worden, in memory of her father-in-law, Shlomo ben Yitzchak Halevi, by Elaine and Harold Vin, in memory of her grandfather, Yitzchak Yehuda ben Meir Tzvi. Okay, may the Shemas have an aliyah, crank Rafia Velti Yeshiva Shema Tzviya, Mechol ben Israel, good Gaben Shtia. Okay. Okay. All right. If someone has come and they have not received the new Aguda Daf Yomi calendar, okay, there are some by the window of the office. Okay, I received a whole bunch in the mail and I put them there. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. All right. It is 25 of 9. We're going to start. I believe we should be on Samich Dalet Amud Beis.
Yep.
Middle.
Second wide line.
Misha Yeshlo Shtei Kitei Banot.
Right. That's
Right?
where we stopped.
That's where we stopped. It is, like you said, the second wide line. Back to our Mishnah. Okay, remember it talked about the fact that there were, if we're talking two groups of daughters, one from wife one, one from wife two, and there's an older and younger girl in each set. Okay, so there are 4 daughters in total. Right? There's the oldest of the older group and the younger of the older group. But the younger of the older group is still older than the oldest of the younger group. Okay, right? And then there's the youngest of the younger group. Okay, so that's why I'm saying you've got to keep in mind 2 groups at least 4 daughters. Okay,
Chicken well done.
all right. Okay, having just reviewed that quickly. All right, Umishi Yeshlo Shtei Kitei Banot, one who has 2, as we said, groups of daughters. Utsricha, and we needed to bring this up as part of our Mishnah. Why? The Iashme'inin Kamaita, because had we only learned the earlier part of our Mishnah, Bahach Ka'amar Rabbi Meir, maybe that was what Rabbi Meir was talking about. The Kevan de Ika Zutramina. Why? Because there is one younger or lower than her, right? Lahach Gdola Karela. For that reason, that's why he was calling her older. In other words, more mature. Okay? Right? Implying that the sense of maturity might have a positive attribute by which she would get married or be possible for marriage earlier or better. Aval Baha, when we're talking about the younger set, and maybe the younger daughter, and maybe we referred to that remember we said that according to there was a mitzvah for him to marry her off, right? Ema mode leila Rabbi Yossi, that maybe in that situation, Rabbi Meir would acknowledge the view of Rabbi Yossi, namely, the katana lahach katana dekuhu karila, that as the youngest of this group, second group, she is the youngest of all of them, and that's why they're calling her the youngest. Ve'i itmar baha, and if we're going to say that we're talking about this youngest, baha ka'amar Rabbi Yossi, in regards to her, that's who Rabbi Yossi is talking about. Aval bahach, but in regards to the oldest daughter, who remember we suggested maybe she had made, if it was only 2 daughters instead of 4, that maybe she made her father her shaliach to allow to find a suitor for her. Ema modele the Rabbi Meir. I might say there in that case, maybe Rabbi Yossi would acknowledge the view of Rabbi Meir, Shricha. And therefore, that's why we needed to bring all these examples. Our Mishnah needed to bring the example of 2 sets of daughters, 4 daughters in total. Okay?
What, from one group to the other, what is it called, a half sister?
There could be, I guess they might be considered a half sister. I mean, it's the same father, just from 2 different wives.
Right.
Okay.
Here's a big one.
Okay. No, that wasn't in that day. That was permissible.
No, still a bigamist.
No.
Bigamist has a.
Okay. He's in other words, he's well-to-do. He can afford 2 wives. Oh, that's another option. Marty's point is a good one. He could have divorced from the first wife and married a second woman, had 2 daughters from her. So that's an option also. Okay. Thank you, Marty, for pointing that out. Okay, what? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure it's not uncommon.
Tzricha, and therefore is needed both. Lamemra, it comes to tell us what? The Rabbi Meir Savar, Michiat Inish, Nafshe Lesfeka, that it's possible that Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that a person might say something which the language is doubtful, questionable. Okay. But Rabbi Yossi, on the other hand, Rabbi Yossi, Savar lo machet inish lesfeka, that Rabbi Yossi would hold that a person does not make a statement where there is doubt in understanding it. Okay? Remember, what the implication the Gemara is going to give us is very significant in just a moment. But maybe it's the opposite that we would learn. Why? Ditznan, because we have a Mishnah that teaches Hanoder ad Pesach, Asur ad sheyagia, ad sheyehe Pesach, Asur ad sheyetzeh. Our Mishnah teaches that one who makes a vow that he won't benefit until Pesach. Okay? Or I'll phrase it another way. He makes a vow that he will not benefit from something on the approach of Pesach. That's more even doubtful. What does it mean on the approach? Does it mean before Pesach, up to Pesach comes? Or does it mean after Pesach has passed? That's what the Gemara is trying to point out. Okay? What happens? Asur ad sheyagia. Is it forbidden up to the time that Pesach arrives? Ad sheyehe Pesach asur ad sheyetzeh. Or maybe it means until Pesach, namely after Passover is done, completed. Right? Why? Because we see ad panei Pesach. If somebody were to use the language until Pesach, Rabbi Meir Omer, says Rabbi Meir, Asur ad sheyagia, that item would be forbidden up till Pesach arrives. Rabbi Yossi Omer, ad sheyetzeh. Rabbi Yossi would say until it ends. Right?
That's odd beyond the thought. Right?
That's part of the question of, right? Okay, so here again we see a machloket between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi in terms of questionable language. Okay, and maybe that applies as well in the situation of when he says, "Oh, my oldest daughter," but we don't know, is that the oldest of the oldest set, or is it the oldest of the younger set? That's the question. That's part of the doubt, right? Amar Rabbi Chanina bar Abdimi, he says, Amar Rav, in the name of Rav, Muchlefet Hashita. Based on that Mishnah, maybe we should say that the difference of opinion is the opposite. Vahatanya. Why? Because we have a Gemara elsewhere, a Braita elsewhere, I'm sorry, that says, and there's some that want to say that that's really that statement, okay, is actually a Gemara in Nedarim, namely, Zeh HaKlal. This is the ruling. Kol shezman kavua, whenever the time is fixed. For example, Pesach is fixed at a specific time, right? Okay, for 14th of Adar. Va'amar ad penei, and they say up to that item. Rabbi Omer, Rabbi says, ad sheyetzeh, until it's over. Rabbi Yossi Omer, says Rabbi Yossi, ad sheyagia, until it arrives. Amar Abaye. And so Abaye now, question? Abaye, however, tries to clarify, machloket b'shtei kitei banot. Our argument between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Meir must be an example of there being two sets of daughters. Aval bekat echat. But if you only have one set of daughters, namely one older and one younger, or even if you had three daughters in that set, the one set, okay? He would still have an older and still have a younger, okay? But what about the middle, right? Divrei hakol gedola mamash. If you're talking about one set of daughters, when he says the oldest, he's actually meaning chronologically the oldest one, okay? Ketana mamash. When he says youngest, he's talking about chronologically the youngest one. Emtsait bishma karela. And if he was referring to the middle daughter, he would refer to her by name and not simply as oldest or youngest. He wouldn't necessarily call her middle. Okay? Right? If you remember there was a Chinese detective. Okay. What? Charlie Chan movies. Number one son, right? And so on, etc. So in other words, the idea of referring to somebody in chronological order was not just something that was understood in Jewish tradition. There was other traditions as well that often referred to children in. Okay. Well, that's a separate issue. Okay. Anyway, the point the mission. Okay, the point I'm making here is that the Gemara's statement that the middle one, if there were three daughters, the middle one would be mentioned by name. And so therefore that would show that when he refers to the oldest, he really meant chronologically old.
It's carried on for 1,600 years to the movie.
Okay, what happens? Amarle Rav Ada says Bar Matna le Abaye, responding back to Abaye's explanation that our machloket must be regarding two sets of daughters. Elame Ata. But from here, what do we learn? And now we get to today's daf a lot. Emsa'id Shebekachniya. Maybe if you are talking about two sets of daughters, okay, and there are at least two daughters in each set, then maybe when the middle one is the oldest of the second set of daughters, okay? Tishtari, maybe she should be, right, permitted to marry, all right? Why is that? Okay, hacha b'mayaskina, because when, what would we be talking about? B'she'ein sham ela gedola uktana, because otherwise we would only be talking about a situation of two daughters, an oldest and a youngest. Vahakinami mistabra, and this seems logical. De'im ita de'ika, because if there were such a middle daughter to exist, litneya, let us teach it, right? V'leta'amech, and according to that, your line of reasoning, Abai, he tells him, emsa'it shebekat rishona, the middle one could be from the first set of daughters. Devadai sfeika, because then we would clearly have this doubt in the language. Va'asirale, and she should be forbidden as well. All right? Mikatanila. So who then is teaching this? Hachi hashta, yes, the Gemara. Abayi might explain, how can you compare it to that? Hatam Tana Katana Dida. There he was teaching the youngest of her. Okay, that she Leisura, and that she would then be forbidden. Vahu Hadin Lahach the Kashisha Mina. And that would be the same ruling or law for one who was older than her. Hacha, here in our case, im ita de ika, were it such that there were a middle daughter, nitnaya, okay, we would have to teach it. And our Mishnah doesn't refer to it whatsoever. Okay, it simply refers to the oldest, the youngest, and the doubtful, is it the oldest of the older set, or the oldest of the younger set, or the younger of the older set, or the younger of the younger set. Okay. Amar le Rav Huna, says Rav Huna bered Rav Yoshua le Rabba, as follows. Ha Pesach, but in regarding the example of Pesach, the chikat echat dami, that we only have one Pesach. It's only one item. Okay, that would be more similar to the example of a situation where there's only one set of daughters. Upligi, and nevertheless, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi argued. Amar lehatam, there he says, Belishna da alma kamiflage. Maybe they're really talking in general, as that's what their language is. Namely, Mar Savar Ad Pnei Pesach. They're talking about the use of the language. One is talking about up to arrival of Pesach, Ad Kame Pischa, until Pesach actually arrives. Umar Savar Ad Mifnei Pischa. And the other is of the opinion that when it says Ad Pnei, it's referring to the passing, that Pesach has been over. Okay, we get to a new Mishnah. Ha'omer le'isha kidashtich. He says to a woman, I betrothed you. V'hi omeret lo kidashtan. And she disagrees and says, I was not betrothed. Hu asur bekrovoteh. He is forbidden from her relatives. In other words, if he were to
he says
he's saying that she's married to him. He can't marry any other of her relatives. Okay? Right? Vihi muteret bekrovav. And she is permitted with his relatives. Next step, we flip it. He omeret kedashtani. She says she was betrothed. Vehu omer lo kedashti. And he says, I did not betroth you. Hu muta bikrovotah. He is permitted in her relatives. Vehi asura bikrovav. And she is forbidden to any of his relatives. Okay. Third scenario.
I mean, isn't this like a little strange? Because the Matthias is, it is or it isn't.
Well, that's the Gemara is going to have to ask that question, isn't it? Okay, that's going to be that may be a question on the part of the Gemara. Okay, don't we know? Okay, or the fact that they disagree. Don't we have another way of proving whether they're betrothed or not? Sure we do. Either we have Adim or we have a document. So shouldn't there be other means? So the Gemara is going to have to raise those issues, I would think. Okay. Kidashtich. Okay, he says, I betrothed you. Vihi omeret lo kidasht ela biti. No, you didn't betroth me, you betrothed my daughter. Hu asur bekrovot gedola. He is forbidden from the relatives of the older, in other words, the mother, right? Ugdola muteret bekrovav. But the older, namely the mother, is permitted to with his relatives. Hu mutar bekrovot katana. But he is permitted to the relatives of the minor, the daughter. Uktana muteret bekrovav. And the minor, the daughter, is permitted to with his relatives. That's the third example. So we've got three parts. Now we get the fourth part of the Mishnah. Kidashti et bitcha. I betrothed your daughter. Vihi omeret lo kidasht ela oti. And she says, okay, you did not betroth me, except I betrothed. Okay, in other words, I am betrothed, but not necessarily to you. Hu asur bekrovot ketana. Okay, he is forbidden in the relatives of the younger, the daughter. Uktana muteret bekrovav. And the younger, the daughter, is permitted to his relatives. Hu mutar bekrovot gedola. He is permitted in the relatives of the older one, namely the mother. Gdola asura bikrovav, and the mother is forbidden to his relatives. So we have four different parts of the Mishnah. So one of the questions, of course, that we're trying to ask is, what's the chiddush here in this particular Mishnah? Okay, are there chidushim on each section or not? Let's see what the Gemara tries to clarify. By the way, we see in this situation, in the second one, that there was really no valid testimony by the mother. Okay? So we've got problems here. Says the Gemara, Ha'omer le'isha kidashtich v'chule. The first Mishnah, the Resha, utsricha. And we needed to spell this out. In other words, among all these four sections. The iyash me'inin gabe didei. If we were saying that it was regarding to him, mishum de gavra lo ichpat le umikre amar. Why? Because it doesn't matter to the husband if he says, I betrothed another woman. Why? Umikre amar. Why? Because he can have more than one wife. All right? Aval ihi, but regarding her, I might say, ilav de kimla b'dibura. If it were not such that this was the language of, there was a valid kiddushin, what happens? Lo havat amra. She wouldn't say anything because she's forbidden
To everybody.
to everybody. Exactly, Reuven. Okay? If this guy claims he married her, okay, that forbids her to anybody else. Okay? But she's claiming, I'm not married to him. Okay? So what's her status? Right? Okay? V'litzar ihu bekrovota. Okay, so let us then forbid. Okay, then forbid him to her relative. Right? Yeah. Okay, Kamash Malan comes to teach us that's not the case. So that's the Chiddush. Okay. Second Mishnah, second part of the Mishnah. Kidashtich vehi omeret. She says she was betrothed. He says betrothed, and she says, right? Hatu. Hear more. Okay. This is the from
The case of the daughter.
right. What happens? Lamali. Why did we have to bring this example? It's tarich. We needed it. Salka da'atach. I mean, it's possible I might say midoraita himna rachamana la'av. That we might say that from the point of view of the Torah, okay, there is a reason to accept the testimony and the validity of the father. Okay, midarabanan himna ladida. But the rabbis say, on the other hand, we should have a reason to believe her. Vatitzar barta b'dibura. And therefore, as a result, her daughter would be forbidden based on that statement. Kamash Malan comes to teach us that that's not the case. Okay. Next part. Kidashti et bitcha v'chuli. Okay, that he betrothed the daughter. Hatu. Here too. Lamali. Why do we need this? Aide de Tana ha. Since they happen to teach this, okay, Tana Nami ha, they also taught this example. In other words, more of a literary parallel in the Mishnah. In order to help you remember, you've got this situation, you got the reverse. You got this situation, then you've got the reverse. Easier for memorization. Okay? Itmar. And about this, the following was said. Rav Amar Kofin. Okay? So what happens here? This woman, okay, if you say he married the daughter, okay, what do we do then? What's her status? She can't marry and the mother says, no, it didn't. Okay, again, we're back in a situation.
Hope and Bessie were forced him to give
Okay,
it.
right. So what happens? Rav said, we force him. Ushmuel Amar Mevakshi. And Shmuel says, we're nice guys, the Beis Din, and we'll just request kindly that he give her a get. Ahia, which then, what are we talking about? Aresha? Are we talking about the first statement of the Mishnah? That he says that the man says he betrothed her and she says no? Okay, and she would then be forbidden in his relatives and he's permitted to her? Is that what we're talking about? If we say it's the first one, lav kofin, ika. There is no compulsion here. Velo mevakshin, ika. And there is no requesting here. Therefore, in other words, it's very outright, straight. Ella asefa. But rather, we must be talking about a later section of the Mishnah. Bishlema mevakshin. That's understandable that we say that we kindly request. L'chaye, because that's the, so to speak, the nice thing, the appropriate thing to do to improve the life of everybody. Ela kofin. But if you say we force it, amai, why is that the case? Amar. And so he says, lo nechali de itza bekarave. He might argue, it's not comfortable for me to be forbidden to her relatives. Ella shamatata hadade itma. But rather, okay, this lesson we've learned, okay, about previously in this case. Namely, this is how we need to understand. Amar Shmuel, says Shmuel, Mivakshin mimenu litain get. We request him to give her a get. Amar Rav, and Rav then is really saying, Im Natan get me'atzmo, if he does willingly give her a get on his own behalf, Kofino to litain ketubah. That acknowledgement seems there may have been some validity to the marriage, to the betrothal, and therefore we do require him to give a ketubah as well. Now, ketubah here could be understood as either the money that she should get from being a broken betrothal, or it could be the document. Okay, that could be the case, and therefore that could be the possibility. Okay, all right, because then one say, oh, she had a ketubah, she has a get, she can marry anybody. Okay, all right. Itmar nami. It was also said as follows: Amar Rav Achabar Ada, Amar Rav, in the name of Rav, Va'amre La, and others say, Amar Rav Achabar Ada, Amar Rav Himnuna, Amar Rav. Okay, so notice we've given the fact that we've dealt with Shmuel's argument. Okay, we've explained Shmuel, that when Shmuel says, be a nice guy and give her a get, Rav is simply adding to that. He's not disagreeing with him. He's simply adding, fine. If he's willing to give her a get, great. But also do this. Now we're coming back to a statement by Rav. Okay? And what is Rav's view of all this when he said kofin? Namely, kofin umivakshin tarte. Do we force and request both? Does that seem reasonable? Hachi kamar. This is what it really means to tell us. Mevakshin mimenu litain get. We request from him to give her a get. V'im natan me'atzmo. And if he gives her from him on his own, kofino tolitain ketubah. We force him then also to give her the ketubah. Okay? So, what happens now? Amar Rav Yehuda. This is Rav Yehuda. And Rav Yehuda is now going to bring a slightly different scenario. Hamikadesh ba'ed echad. What happens if that betrothal, okay, occurs in front of only one witness? Okay, we know normally it has to be before two witnesses. Why might I argue it has to be before two witnesses? I might argue because there's an issue of ketubah, of money involved. And therefore, whenever there's a situation of mammon, right, we always need two witnesses. On the other hand, we know elsewhere, and we're going to may get to that Gemara today, hopefully, Eid Echad is valid for Isura. And what happens? If she's betrothed, she is forbidden, as is Isur, to all other men. So maybe I could even argue, maybe Kedushin in front of one witness ought to be adequate, ought to be sufficient. So now I understand why we have this question, why it's really a valid question. Okay? By Rav Yehuda. What happens? Hamikadesh ba'ed echad. One who betrothed, right? What does he say? Ein chosheshin l'kiddushin. We don't rely on it, expect it as a valid kiddushin. Ba'u minei mi Rav Yehuda. And so the other sages asked Rav Yehuda, Shneihem modin. What happens if the two of them, the couple, the man and the young woman, agree with the aid and say, yes, you're right. Okay, what's the situation? Envelope, yes and no. Verafia, biadeh. And Rabbi Yehuda sort of wavered with this issue. In other words, he really wasn't sure, as we just tried to suggest what the issue was. Itmar, and about this the following was said. Amar Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel. Says Rav Nachman in the name of Shmuel. Hamikadesh ba'ed echad, one who betroths with one witness, ein chosheshin l'kiddusha. We don't expect, that we don't count this as valid. Va'afilu shnehem modin, even if both of them agree. What happened though? Eitive Rava, the Rav Nachman. Rava challenges Rav Nachman on this issue. Ha'omer li'isha kidashtich, v'hi omeret lo kidashtani. What about our Mishnah that said, right, the following? One who says, I betrothed her. She says she didn't betroth, was not betrothed. Hu asur b'krovoteh. He's forbidden with her relatives. V'hi muteret b'krovav. That she is permitted with his relatives. That seems to disagree with what that issue is, right? Ida ika edim, if there are edim, emai muteret bekrovav. Why then should she be permitted to his relatives?
If they're Adam, there's a valid kedusha.
Right, exactly. Ve'ida leka edim, and if there are no witnesses, amai asur bekrovotea. Why then is he forbidden to her relatives? Right? Ela lav be'edechat. Rather, it must be that the situation is such that there was only one witness. Or I could argue maybe the witnesses aren't available. Okay? Hacha b'mayaskinim. What are we talking about? Kegon de amarla kedashtir b'fnei ploni uploni v'halchu lahem lemedinat hayam. Okay, that's the other part. That we were betrothed in front of Meshi Pipik and Chaim Yankel, but both of them went on a business trip to someplace. Okay, ATV. But I'll challenge this with the following example. Hamigareshet ishto, one who divorces his wife. Velana imo befundaki, and she happens to stay in the same inn, okay? Same motel. Beit Shammai omrim einat tzricha himenu get sheni. Beit Shammai says there is no need for a second bill of divorce. Beit Hillel omrim tzricha himenu get sheni. And Beit Hillel says she does need from him a second bill of divorce. Why? We think there may have been hanky-panky, even though he divorced her. Okay? Hechidami, how is that possible? Ida ika edim, if there are witnesses, maita maihu de Beit Shammai. What then is the reasoning of Beit Shammai? Deleka edim, when there are no witnesses, maita maihu de Beit Hillel. What then is the reasoning of Beit Hillel? Ella lav be'ed echad. Rather, it must be a situation where there was only a single witness. Ulata'ameich, and according to your reasoning, ema sefer. I would say that must apply to the later statement in our Mishnah. Umodim b'nitgarsha min ha'erusim. And it must be a situation where he divorced her from the betrothal. She'ein tzricha mimenu get sheni. And therefore, that's the reason that he doesn't need a second bill of divorce. Mipnei she'ein libo gasba. Why? Because he doesn't know her well enough to even consider any activities.
They were only heiress, and
They were only
really
heiress,
married,
right.
so that he would.
Right, he wouldn't do it. However, you and I, we all know, by the way, that from other Gemaras, just real quick to throw it out, that there was a difference between Galil and Yehuda in terms of to what degree the suitor was intimate, so to speak, with his fiance. Okay, so this argument in the Gemara we'll leave as is for now. All right, lo gaspa. And if you want to think Eidechad mehaman, that a single witness is believed, mali min ha'erusin. What then are we talking about erusin? Mali min ha'nisuin. What difference then should it be between erusin? What difference should it be between nisuin with one witness? Elahacha b'mayaskin. And what are we talking about? Kagon deika ede yichud veleka ede bia. Why we're talking about a situation where, yes, there were witnesses that they were secluded, but there was no witnesses that they had relations. Beit Shammai Savre, says Beit Shammai. Okay, and by the way, all of this deals with the concept of Shavua Anafshe Chaticha de Isura, that a person can make something forbidden for himself, okay, based on his testimony. Okay, so what happens? Beit Shammai, we said, was of the opinion, and I'm trying to move a little faster now. Lo amrinin hein edei. We don't say that they were the same witnesses, both those that were seclusion, hein edei bia, that they were also the witnesses for relations. Ubeit Hillel Savre amrinin hein edei yichud, hein edei bia. And Beit Hillel says we do have the understanding that the same witnesses for seclusion are the witnesses for bia. Umodim, and they acknowledge, vadai benitgarsha min ha'erusin, that it's clear when she's been separated, divorced from the betrothal, delo amrin hein edei yichud hein edei bia, that we don't say there that the same witnesses for yichud are the seclusion are the same witnesses for relations, mipnei she'en libo gaspa, because he is not so inclined and the status of erusin to be intimate with her. Now, what happens? Amar Rav Yitzchak. We now get to another new theme. It says Rav Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta mishmei de Rav, in the name of Rav. Hamikadesh be'ed echad ein chosheshin lekidusha. We're now saying that according to this, I'm going to say Masorah, right? This Masorah that's based on Rav, okay? That betrothal with a single witness, we don't accept it.
Even if they both agree.
Okay? Va'afilu shnehem modim, right, Ruvain. Even if they both agree, continues the Gemara. Now, what happens though? Amar Rava bar Rav Huna, hamikadesh be'ed echad, one who betroths with a single witness. Beit Dina Rabba, the great Beit Din, Amrei ein chosheshin lekidusha. We do not suspect. We do not. I don't like the word suspect. We don't deal with, right. We don't worry about the kedusha. Man Beit Dina de Barabba, who is the great Beit Din? Okay, what's the answer? Rav. It's Rav. Okay, ve'ika da Amrei. But there are those who phrase it the following way. Amar Rava bar Rav Huna, says Rav Huna, Rabba bar Huna, Amar Rav in the name of Rav. Hamikadesh be'ed echad, one who betroths with a single witness. Beidina Rabba Amre, the great Beidin says, Ein chosheshin lekedusha. We don't worry about his kedushin, his betrothal. Man Beidina Rabba, whose is the great Beidin? Ravi. Now here, we just need a quick clarification. We normally think of Rebbe as Rebbe Yehuda Hanassi, but here we have to understand that it's really referring to Rav. And who is he referring to?
Rebbe means Rebbe Hanassi.
No, it doesn't. I have to disagree here. I think that at least the shir I listened to said no, it refers to Rav here because he's referring to his Rebbe. You've got our
statement talked about Rav. Now you're saying that the Beit Din of Rabbi is also Rav. So there's no argument.
Right, there is no argument. Okay, so that's the point. Okay, so let's go on. Meitiv Rav of Dubai Bar Ami. This is a sage. I don't think we've come across his name hardly at all in the Gemara. Right? Shnayim Shabau Medinat Hayam. Two came from across the sea. V'isha imahem. Okay, and there's a woman with them. So we've got three people, two men, one woman, right? V'chavila imahem. And there's property, okay, with them. Ze omer, one of the men says, Zo ishti v'ze avdi. This is my wife and this is my servant, v'zo chavilati. And this is my property. V'ze omer. The second man says, right? Zo ishti v'ze avdi. This is my wife, and this is my property. V'zo chavilati. Right? Third now, the woman says, v'isha omer, and she says, elu shnei avdi. These are my two servants. V'chavila shali, and the package is mine. Right? What happens? Sricha shnei gitin, she requires two bills of divorce, v'gova ketubata min hachavila, and she gains her monetary amount of the ketubah from the property that they brought with them. So Gemara picks up, Hechi Dami, how is this possible? Ida eat le sahade lahai, if there are witnesses to this, V'eat, okay, to this one. V'eat le sahade lahai, and if there are witnesses to this one. Mi matse amra elu shnei avdi, is it possible that she would say, these are my two servants, v'chavila shali, and this is my property, right? In other words, how can her statement contradict two actual witnesses? Ela lav ba'ed echad. No, it must be a situation where we have a single witness.
Each one of the men had one witness saying that he was Makanish.
Okay, we'll see. Right? So what happened? V'tisbara, and is that possible? Eid echad b'hakasha mihem haman, with only a single witness that is challenging. Is that really make that possible? Is it feasible? Ela lemishrei, okay, but rather only to permit it. In other words, we could use one witness to permit her to marry without a get. Okay, but what happens here? Eid echad b'hakasha mihaminin ela lemishrei, but that's really only to permit her to marry. La alma, the kuli alma, lo plige deshari. In general, everybody would agree that we don't disagree to permit her to marry. But here in our case, hachikama, this is what we're saying. Sricha shnei gitin, she needs two bills of divorce, kedei legabot ketubata min hachavila, in order to gain her ketuba money from the property. The Rabbi Meir, and this is the view of Rabbi Meir. The Amar metaltale mishta'abde ketuba, that metaltalin, as opposed to karka, which we normally think is the valid property to support the ketubah, Rabbi Meir is saying no, even movable property is valuable enough to provide the right, and she can collect, right? Right. My havela. So what then do we have here? Rav Kahana Amar. Okay, says Rav Kahana. Ein chosheshin lekidusha. According to Rav Kahana, we don't worry about this betrothal. Rav Papa Amar chosheshin lekidusha. Rav Papa says we do worry about this betrothal. Okay, the shir I listened to, by the way, implies that because, by the way, Rav Papa and Rav Kahana and Rav Papa are achronim, that the law really follows them. But which one do you follow? So the halacha he mentioned real quick, and just to share it, is that while in general we follow the rule of Rav Kahana, we are still choshesh to the view of Rav Papa. Okay? So coming back now to our mission, our text. Amarle Rav Ashi, says Rav Ashi the Rav Kahana, Maidatech. What's your view? How do you explain yourself? Right? Right? Dielefet davar davar mimamon. All right, is it a question of learning a gzera shava of the words davar davar based on money? A malahalan hoda'at ba'al din kemeya edim dami, where there, okay, the testimony, okay, of the Baal Din, of the person participating, one of the litigants, let's call him, right, is like 100 witnesses. Afkan hoda'at Baal Din kemeya edim dami. So here too, if you're going to make that comparison based on money, then the testimony of one of the litigants should be equivalent to 100 witnesses and apply here too. So that's the case. If she had one witness, okay, that there was a valid betrothal, okay, or that the situation is like she says, that should be adequate. Afkan hoda'at baldin k'me'edim dam. Amarle hatam Lo kachayev la'achrine. There, however, that doesn't make an obligation of somebody else. Hacha kachayev la'achrine. Here in our case, we see an obligation is made of somebody else. So now the Gemara picks up on this theme. Mar Zutra v'Rav Ada Saba, right? B'nei derav Mari bar Isa. There were two brothers, Mar Zutra and Rav Ada Saba, the sons of Mari bar Isa. Palig nichsaihu bahadi hadade. And when the father died, they divided up the inheritance. So what happened? Remember, the inheritance is money. And does it have to be done before Eidim? Particularly two Eidim. Atu lakami de Rav Ashi. They came before Rashi. Amrule, and they said to him, Al pi shnei Eidim amar Rachmana. According to the Torah, monetary divisions must be based on testimony of two witnesses. The ibai lemehadeh lo matzi hadre baho. That if we come to recant, to change the mind, right? It would mean that the witnesses would have to bring truth to establish, all right, what the kinyan is. That's why you need the witnesses. Lo matzeh hadre baho. We would not be able to change it. Va'anan lo hadre. Okay, and we're not interested in changing. O dilma, or perhaps lo mikaima milta elabisahade, or perhaps our entire transaction of dividing the property, okay, it doesn't work because there were no witnesses. Okay? Amar laho, he said to them, lo ibru sahade ela l'shakre, that the purpose of the creation of testimony of witnesses was only be able to be against liars. In other words, to give credence to the act. That's what the purpose of the witnesses is. Amar Abaye, okay, and so Abaye picks up and says now as follows, right? Amar lo ed echad. What if there was only one witness? Achal chelev, and they say, you know what? You ate chelev. Vahala shotek, and the person is silent, right? He doesn't know what to happen. Ne'aman, it would seem that that person, that one witness is believed. Vatana tuna, and we have learned this. Amar lo eid echad achal chelev. If one witness says that you ate chelev, vahala omer lo achalti, but the person challenges and says, I did not eat patur, then he is exempt. Tama, the reasoning, amar lo, because he said no. Ha ishtik, but if he's silent, mehaman, then the one witness would be believed. Va'amar Abaye, as we begin to finish up, amar lo ed echad nitma'u tarotecha. Okay, one witness says that that which was pure has become unclean, defiled. Vahala shotek, and the person is silent. Ne'eman, the witness is believed. V'tana tuna, and we learn this. Eid echad omer nitma'u. If one witness says it became impure, vahala omer lo nitma'u, and the other says it did not become impure, patur, he exempt. Ta'ama da'amar lo. The fact that he said no, ha'ishtik mehaman, the fact that he was silent, then that one witness would be believed. And we're going to stop right there. Okay?
Traveling through, you're here for the winter, you're traveling through.
Okay.
But I normally
I'll
travel that day.
meet you outside. I'm going to the,
Yeah, I just got to put my stuff away in my locker.
no rush.
Okay.
When is your turn?
Huh?
When is your turn?